I never imagined that a verdict could keep me awake all night, questioning every word I signed. I am Latasha Coleman, a judge in Baltimore, and this is the story of a case that challenged not only the law, but my own sense of justice. It was a legal process full of contradictions and cracks where nothing seemed to fit properly. Every argument presented was compelling, yet also opposed to the other, a tangled web I didn't know how to unravel without losing something valuable. I signed the verdict because I had to, because the law demanded a decision, but doubt was my only companion for weeks. How do you make a decision when every piece of the puzzle is broken? Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The case was both simple and complicated at the same time. A young man accused of a serious crime, with evidence that seemed to establish his guilt, but also testimonies and details that didn't fit, raising more questions than answers. My office in Baltimore became a battlefield between evidence and silence, between half-truths and contradictory arguments. On one side, the prosecution, firm and confident they had proven the case. On the other, the defense, desperate to show their client's innocence. I was caught in the middle, with the responsibility to decide something definitive and the weight of knowing that a wrong decision could ruin a life. The days leading up to signing were a mental torture. I reviewed the case file over and over, looking for a solid foundation to justify every point of the verdict. But nothing was as clear as it seemed. I found cracks in every line, fissures in every testimony. The law pointed me down a path, but reality refused to follow it in a straight line. The uncertainty grew until I couldn't sleep. I remember the exact night. Something happened inside me I didn't expect. I stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling the weight of every word floating in the air, without a real anchor. It was in that solitude that I understood something fundamental. Being a judge is not just about applying the law, it's about living with its consequences. Many believe that once you sign, your job is done. But it's not. That signature stays in your conscience, in the story of a person, and in yours as well. That night, I didn't close my eyes thinking about the young man's future, his family, the justice system we all trust when we seek fairness. There were no easy answers, no absolute certainties, only the bitter certainty of a decision that would condemn me to question myself forever. Finally, I signed the verdict. I did it with a heavy heart and a divided mind. I knew I had done what I had to do, but also that justice is often not black or white, but gray, full of shadows where the complete truth is lost. And since then, every time I hear about similar cases, I remember that night. And I know that deep down, all judges carry that same uncertainty, that same internal struggle that never ends. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to stand on that scale, with everything at stake and no absolute truth, this is my confession. Because in the end, beyond the robe and the gavel, we are humans facing our own doubts. I couldn't take my eyes off the file nor stop reviewing every line, every testimony, as if it were a danse macabre. That night, in my office, the city seemed more distant than usual, as if a dense fog had settled between the outside world and my consciousness. The verdict was signed, but something inside me resisted accepting that everything was truly resolved. For weeks, I reviewed the case over and over, unable to find a definitive point to anchor myself. There were details that at first seemed minor, almost insignificant, but that gradually began to carry an overwhelming weight. For example, the evidence presented in court, although seemingly solid, had invisible cracks that only someone with extreme patience could detect. The central testimony, a woman whose trembling voice filled the room with an indescribable emotional weight, contained subtle contradictions, impossible to ignore. I remember that every time I closed my eyes to try to fall asleep, those words came back to me, spinning in difficult-to-tame spirals. Had I allowed my prejudices, those I try to keep under control, but that we all have, to interfere with my judgment? Had I rushed at any moment? Not because I doubted the law or the procedures, but because I realized that behind every file, behind every sentence, there are lives that change forever. Then began a sensation that quickly became almost physical. Doubts settled in my chest, a constant pressure that accompanied me during the day, but intensified in the quietest hours. Every time I woke up in the middle of the night, I felt an urgent need to connect with the file, to search, analyze, and understand how such a truth could have so many opposing faces. One day, during a routine session at the court, I received an anonymous letter, written with hurried and almost illegible handwriting. It said only, "Not everything is as it seems. Look beyond the obvious." The envelope was empty, with no indication of who had sent it, but the message was an unexpected blow to a narrative I had believed in control of until then. From that moment, I became obsessed with every detail, every piece of information that could give me an additional clue. I reviewed testimonies that seemed clear and yet held ambiguities. I spoke privately with lawyers, with people who had been close to the process, trying to understand whether perhaps someone had made a mistake or, worse, had manipulated justice. But no one gave me satisfactory answers. Rather, I felt a dense, suspicious silence. The most desperate realization was that some pieces of the puzzle did not fit only because of human frailty, but because, deep down, there were invisible forces, decisions made in the shadows. I faced the harsh reality that justice is not an infallible mechanism nor an immovable beacon. It is a turbulent sea, with currents that sometimes elude the reach of a single judge. And I was sailing those waters with a compass that occasionally failed. Those days cost me more than I had imagined. My health suffered the weight of responsibility. My family saw me as distant, almost like someone trapped in a mental prison without visible walls. But I couldn't stop. Justice demanded that price from me. I tried to talk to my colleagues, but even they seemed to avoid the subject, as if speaking of doubts were a sign of weakness or incompetence. Yet, what is a judge if not someone willing to question, to seek impartiality amid chaos? Nights became my best allies and, at the same time, my worst enemies. In the absolute solitude of the closed court, I turned on the lights in my office and returned again and again to the testimonies, the recordings, and the documents I had filed just days before. In one of those moments, while reviewing the main file, I found something that had gone unnoticed. It wasn't an obvious error, nor a forgery. It was a small detail in an expert report that, when crossed with another testimony, uncovered a serious contradiction. Something that could change the course of the entire process. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. How was it possible that this had gone unnoticed during the trial? Had I misunderstood some evidence? Or was there someone who deliberately concealed that information? That revelation shook my certainties and reignited a flame of unease in me that I didn't know whether I should feed or let extinguish. For days, I studied that new clue carefully, seeking to confirm its validity and understand its implications. What I found not only questioned the innocence or guilt of the accused, but also the integrity of the entire process. I understood that I was at a critical point, where signing the sentence I had already dictated or retracting it not only involved a legal decision, but a true moral act. That was when I decided to take a step that to many might seem irrational, to reopen the case. I knew that with this, my career and reputation would be at stake. I knew I would be opening a door to furious criticism and questioning that could go far beyond the professional. But I also understood that justice, the one whose responsibility I swore to uphold, could not be trapped by inertia or formalism. When I announced the review of the case, I felt both relief and fear. Relief because I was following an inner compass indicating the right path, and fear because any mistake, any miscalculated move, could unleash an immeasurable storm. Media pressure began to grow, and with it, whispers in the corridors of the court and in the city. Some considered me a brave heroine, others a confused woman unable to uphold her own decisions. The most striking moment came after weeks of re-examination, when the landscape really began to change. New evidence emerged, and people who had previously kept silent now dared to speak. I discovered networks of conflicting interests, hidden influences that had tainted the original process. I understood that the law is not just the text printed in books, but a living web that many try to manipulate for their own benefit. In those moments of crisis, amid heated debates and endless nights, I asked myself again and again what kind of judge I wanted to be. Someone who clings to the authority of the position or one who risks challenging the system in search of truth. In an instant, I understood that true justice does not reside in absolute certainty, but in the courage to acknowledge uncertainty and fight against it. My most uncertain sentence took on a new meaning. It was no longer just a document signed with latent doubts, but a call for deep reflection on power, responsibility, and the consequences of every decision. Something within me changed forever. Absolute certainty, that illusion I had pursued for years, faded away, leaving an uncomfortable space, yes, but also full of possibilities. On my way home, on sleepless nights, I embrace that unease. I know I won't find easy or definitive answers, but I also know that my role is not to dictate unmovable truths, but to keep the flame of justice alive, aware of its shadows and lights. The next time I sign a sentence, I will do it with more humility and awareness, knowing that it is, ultimately, a human act, complex and full of nuances. And now, as I tell this, I want you to feel it with me. Justice is not a solid building nor a sealed story. It is a path traveled with uncertain steps, sometimes forcing us to look into the abyss of our own doubts, and yet go on, with the deep conviction that what is just is not always easy, but it is necessary. That very night when I could not close my eyes, I understood that the true sentence was not on paper. It was in my will to keep searching, tirelessly, for a place where justice can shine with all its complexity. The hours seemed to blur in that whirlwind I found myself in. Every document revived previous conversations, revealed new doubts, and sent me thinking about faces, voices, and silences that, until then, I had relegated to mere echoes of the past. But now every little detail took on an unbearable, almost tangible weight. I felt how the truth slipped through my fingers, elusive and changeable, like a shadow that refuses to be caught. My mind refused to rest, because that internal search was no longer just a professional duty. It had become an urgency, a moral imperative that consumed me. Little by little, I discovered that the pieces of the puzzle were not only crooked, but that some had been placed with deliberate care to make them seem to fit. There were names that, upon further investigation, took on new meanings. Key witnesses whose accounts changed depending on whom they had been speaking to outside the room. And what disturbed me the most, records that seemed insignificant, hidden on the margins, full of emails, footnotes, text messages, where certain interests seemed to weave an invisible web, where the law, with its apparent rigidity, broke easily. But the most disconcerting thing was not only discovering that the case was tainted by these influences, it was understanding that the judicial system itself, designed to protect truth and fairness, could be vulnerable, even complacent. I faced a system that, despite its facade of impartiality, dealt daily with political, economic, and social pressures that shaped, even unintentionally, the verdicts. This revelation radically changed my perception of justice. I could no longer see it as merely a legal matter, but as a deeply human act where honesty fights against hidden interests and where every decision can tip the scales toward light or shadow. At one point, I felt I was being watched, as if my movements aroused suspicion in someone who preferred everything to remain swept under the rug. My way of proceeding, clearly different from that of my colleagues, attracted inquisitive looks and uncomfortable silences. I recalled a conversation I had with an old mentor who once told me, "Latasha, the power to decide is a gift, but also a burden. Not everyone is prepared to bear its weight." I had never fully understood that phrase until I revisited it amidst that whirlwind that surrounded me. As I delved deeper, I realized the anonymous letter was not a random act but a desperate call from someone who, within that web, was trying to reach the truth. Then I wondered who could know the best-kept secrets, risking something as vulnerable as their anonymity. A remorseful witness? Someone inside the system? Or a mere observer filled with rage at injustice? That question haunted me every night as I reordered the pieces, trying to build a figure truer to the real pain locked in that initial sentence. Fear visited me often, not only because of possible professional repercussions, but also because of the emotional instability I found myself immersed in. There were nights when I stood before the mirror, wondering if my pulse remained steady because it had to or because I clung to a conviction that was fading in the dark. I knew that moving forward meant not only giving up my certainties, but accepting that the answers could be as painful as necessary. However, the idea of abandoning the search now seemed to me an act of betrayal toward the very essence of justice. The case became an obsession shared by very few people I still trusted. I spoke in whispers with a couple of trusted colleagues who also felt that silent weight spreading when uncomfortable truth threatens to crack established structures. I sought advice from experts in areas seemingly distant from law, from data analysts to forensic psychologists, trying to better understand the contradictions that emerged. All those external perspectives acted like beacons illuminating angles I could never have seen alone. It was in those exchanges I understood that justice should not depend solely on my limited perspective. It needed to be open, plural, capable of reinventing itself in the face of shadows. Once, while reviewing a recorded testimony late at night, I noticed a prolonged silence just before the witness's voice resumed the statement. Something about that pause, almost imperceptible, made me stop. I pursued that detail and requested access to all the unedited full audio. What I discovered left me frozen. There were mutilated fragments, cuts seemingly designed to hide certain emotions and important phrases that could reshape the understanding of the facts. That explained why part of the account seemed disconnected. Someone had wanted to silence an uncomfortable truth. I then decided to seek help outside the system. I contacted investigative journalists who had the resources to dig into archives and follow hidden leads. It was not easy to gain their trust, as they initially distrusted my intentions or doubted the validity of the story. However, upon sharing the evidence and my concern, they understood the magnitude of the problem, and we united in that arduous and dangerous search. Their work was vital in uncovering links between some characters in the case and companies with multi-million-dollar interests that never surfaced during the initial trial. Alongside that work, my personal life cracked. My children saw me as an absent figure, my friends called without getting responses, and my husband, though understanding, already feared the burden this situation was causing me. But there was no turning back. Every time I received a new piece that could clarify the truth, exhaustion seemed to momentarily fade and a renewed drive took control. I was no longer motivated by professional rigor, but by a deep conviction that challenged my own limits. There was a moment when I almost gave in to burnout. The pressure to close the case once and for all intensified, criticisms increased, and the voices labeling me reckless and destabilizing grew louder. I even received veiled threats, subtle, slipping in the form of anonymous messages and warnings disguised as advice. But it was amid that storm that I remembered why I had chosen this profession, to be a beacon of hope for those whose voices often fade in the noise of the system. Suddenly, everything changed when I managed to speak in person with one of the most important and enigmatic people in the case, a man who had been a key witness, but who, until then, had remained absolutely silent. We met in a discreet cafe, and I saw how his eyes reflected a fear repressed for years, but also a longing for justice. He told me things that were never heard in court, accounts that traced another path and evidence that would expose the web of corruption, negligence, and manipulation surrounding the process. In that conversation, I understood that justice was not a linear path but a winding road, full of twists where difficult truths and shocking revelations hide. Returning to the court with that new perspective and armed with renewed evidence, I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. I knew the coming weeks would define not only the fate of the case, but also the direction of my career and my life. But I was willing to follow that path, regardless of the consequences. Because the justice I had learned to love is not a pristine ideal, it is a constant commitment to the truth, even when it looks at us with eyes full of uncertainty. In that labyrinth of decisions and conflicting emotions, I found a new meaning to the term sentence. It was no longer merely a legal document, but an act that transforms over time, that can be reviewed, questioned, and reconstructed in the name of authentic justice. The most uncertain sentence had become the bravest, because it meant acknowledging that absolute certainty does not exist, and that sometimes, what really matters is the courage to face that doubt with integrity. As I move forward on this path, I keep remembering those sleepless nights, the fog that covered the city, and the invisible weight that forced me to look beyond the obvious. I know the story is not over. Many chapters remain to be written, with more questions than answers, and with a firm purpose, that, although justice is an uncertain sea, we must be beacons that never cease to shine, even in the darkest hours. The meeting with that man was, without a doubt, a turning point. I left that cafe feeling as if I had lifted the curtain on a theater much darker and more complex than I had imagined. Those words, those details he had so carefully confided to me, rekindled a flame within me that I thought had been extinguished. However, that spark did not bring with it the certainty I longed for. Rather, it resembled the profound uncertainty that enveloped everything. From that moment on, every step I took became a careful dance between hope and fear, between the conviction that I had to seek the truth and the imminent risk of facing forces that would prefer everything to remain invisible. Days passed, and the weight of the evidence increased on my desk, in my thoughts, and even in my dreams. I reviewed the documents over and over again, trying to find connections, patterns, blind spots. Suddenly, an apparently banal email took on a different meaning. A simple line in a text message that, when analyzed closely, showed signs of a covert conversation. They were small, almost imperceptible details, but they exhibited that coded language that only those who are part of the network could understand. I began to feel that I was not only uncovering a case, but that I had inadvertently become part of a dangerous game, in which every move could trigger unpredictable consequences. One of the most disturbing clues came from a forgotten virtual folder among the files delivered by the prosecutor's office. It was full of documents that, on the surface, had no direct relation to the case, but, when combined with testimonies and recordings, took on new meaning. I found suspicious financial transactions, exchanges of emails mentioning cryptic terms, and dates that coincided with key events in the judicial process. I began to visualize a web where some actors benefited from silence and where corruption dressed itself subtly to avoid detection. It was then that I understood that this invisible network not only manipulated evidence, but also people willing to sacrifice justice for personal interests. Each advance in the investigation attracted new threats, now more direct and concrete. I received calls with silences that chilled the blood, messages with veiled warnings, and found suspicious marks on my front door. Paranoia began to creep in, but I tried to stay strong. I remembered the voices of those children and adults who had trusted me, who expected my decision to be fair and truthful, not a surrender to external pressures. That was when I decided I could no longer go it alone. I strengthened my ties with the small groups of colleagues I trusted and established discreet communication channels with investigative journalists. I could not let fear paralyze me, although I knew losing my balance was easier than it seemed. Amid this whirlwind, an unexpected call changed the course of the inquiry. It was someone who identified only as a disgruntled employee of one of the companies linked to the case. His words were a whisper breaking the silence. There were key documents, hidden on an internal server, containing irrefutable proof of financial backing for certain witnesses and manipulation of scientific evidence. He offered to help me access them, but the condition was clear: absolute anonymity. I knew that information could be the decisive proof, but I also understood that I had to act with extreme caution. Accessing that digital network was opening a door to a dark world that could consume everything I loved. The following days were unusually intense. I coordinated with some cybersecurity experts to establish protocols that would allow me to review the material without leaving a trace. My heart beat so fast I felt it could break at any moment. Every file opened, every word read, confirmed to me that the machinery of corruption was bigger, more sophisticated than I had imagined. Names of influential politicians appeared, lawyers with impeccable reputations on the surface, and companies with multi-million-dollar interests in public contracts. Reality struck hard. The justice I had believed impartial now revealed itself as a mechanism shaped by powerful interests, where truth was only a piece in play. Despite the risk, I felt that the courage to remain faithful to my principles was stronger than any threat. I reflected on all the internal conversations I had had, all the sleepless nights, all the moments of doubt and solitude. The awareness that every person before me deserved not only a fair trial, but a real chance to be heard pushed me to continue. The cost was high, I knew. I was risking not only my career and safety, but also challenging the very system that had shaped me and in which I believed. But what purpose would justice serve if I were incapable of confronting the flaws and shadows that obscured it? In the search, I found something unexpected, a group of people within the system, not many, but enough to make a difference. Men and women in varied positions, from officials to judicial assistants, who shared a genuine commitment to the truth and who had known corruption from the inside, but had also decided to act, even if silently. Their complicity, beyond being an act of bravery, was a relief. For the first time, I felt I was not alone fighting against all odds. That informal network of support began sharing information that enriched the panorama and allowed me to build a new version, closer to the reality hidden behind layers of interests and lies. However, amid that support, a new obstacle arose. One of my closest colleagues, someone I had trusted, began to grow distant, evade questions, and downplay my progress. It didn't take long to discover that he was being pressured and that certain sectors had set a trap to silence his voice before he could speak. Seeing that betrayal so close hurt me, but it also made me stronger. I decided to distance myself from those unwilling to maintain a firm ethic, no matter the cost. The path I had chosen admitted no half measures. Blind trust was a luxury I could not afford. I had to remain alert without losing the humanity I defended. As days turned into weeks, media pressure grew. What had been a closed and forgotten matter by most began to awaken public interest. People needed to understand what lay behind that controversial sentence. The exhaustion was palpable, but I also felt that the voice of justice was regaining lost ground. On several occasions, during hearings and meetings, I noticed looks oscillating between open hostility and restrained curiosity. That reminded me that I had crossed an invisible line separating the comfort of complacency from the courage to face the truth. There was no turning back. Despite everything, there were moments of light. Receiving messages of support from people who identified with the fight for real and transparent justice filled me with energy. More than once, strangers shared their own stories of corruption or injustice, showing that this was not an isolated case, but a symptom of something much bigger. It transcended the boundaries of a single judicial process and evidenced the urgent need to reform a system that frequently sacrificed the most vulnerable on the altar of convenience and power. One early morning, while reviewing a folder full of documents freshly delivered by those internal sources, I found a file that changed the game. It was a video recorded by a security camera showing a clandestine meeting between some of the individuals involved in the manipulation of evidence. The image was blurry, but enough to recognize those who conversed behind the back of justice. That visual proof gave a face to the theory I had painstakingly reconstructed. Knowing I could demonstrate beyond any doubt that the corruption network was real gave me a drive I hadn't felt in a long time. However, it also reminded me that exposing that truth implied an even greater risk, one that could ignite the system and put those around me in check. Despite feeling like I was walking on a tightrope, I remained calm. I used that evidence to strengthen requests for case review and, in parallel, to prepare a plan that would allow the truth to be revealed safely and responsibly. The importance of not unleashing a greater institutional crisis was constantly on my mind. I knew that justice needed to rest on firm foundations to be rebuilt, not collapse into chaos that would only benefit the corrupt. Amid this whirlwind of discoveries and internal battles, there was a moment of deep introspection. I wondered what justice really meant and whom it truly served. I thought of all those families, those faces marked by the sentence, and how my decisions could transform their lives. The responsibility was overwhelming, but that awareness strengthened me more than any fear. Justice, I understood, was a constant act of humility and commitment. It was not achieved with a signature or a ruling, but with a conscious mind and the courage to always do what is right, even when certainty never accompanies us. Now, with my gaze set on the future, I cannot deny that uncertainty remains a constant companion. I know the next steps will be difficult, and that the struggle is just beginning. But I also know that I have discovered an essential truth. Justice is not a fixed destination, but a path built with every act of integrity and every decision that challenges the shadows. No matter how dark the sea we navigate may seem, even if the storm rages and the horizon remains blurred, we must be the beacons that never stop shining, guiding others toward the light, with the certainty that the truth, though elusive, always deserves to be pursued to the end. That is, in the end, the bravest verdict I can leave, not a decision sealed on paper, but an eternal commitment to authentic justice and human integrity. The days that followed that discovery marked a new level in this seemingly endless struggle. The presence of the video gave me something I urgently needed: tangible, concrete evidence that justified not only suspicion but decisive action. But, as often happens with the truth when it threatens powerful interests, it soon attracted the shadows that always follow those who dare to challenge the status quo. The tension began to rise almost palpably. Every move I made inside and outside the offices seemed monitored, every word careful, every glance analyzed in extreme detail. I became a target, not only for what I knew but for what that truth represented, a truth that refused to remain hidden. I remember nights when, while reviewing and reorganizing files in my office, I felt a weight on my shoulders, as if gravity itself tried to sink me into uncertainty. It wasn't just physical fatigue, but the emotional burden that comes with knowing that around me, some pieces were moving beyond my full control on the board. There was a power play that surpassed decades of apparent stability and suddenly appeared vulnerable. Yet, the fragility of that moment did not diminish its power. I knew every small mistake could be fatal. Therefore, I took extreme precautions. I encrypted every file, frequently changed the routes I took, and limited communication to a very small, trusted circle. Among these confidences, suspicions grew about the loyalty of some close collaborators. Double-dealing is a cruel weapon in these circles, and I discovered that some had ties beyond the professional, connected to personal interests that preferred this scandal be buried as soon as possible. To avoid falling into the trap of paranoia, I learned to distinguish between fearful interpretation and real threat. It was a slow and painful process. Amid distrust, I clung to the principle I have always defended: justice is born from knowledge, not from hasty judgment. But I also realized that prudence was a virtue I needed to cultivate intensely so as not to sabotage the effort made so far. External pressure intensified when some media outlets began leaking fragments of the case and rumors about the corruption I was trying to expose. Reactions were polarized and loud. While one sector celebrated the courage to reveal the truth, others launched campaigns to discredit me, questioning my professional integrity and impartiality. It was a direct blow to the confidence I had in my role as a judge. At first, I doubted. I felt I was at risk of losing direction. But the uncertainty that had once been paralyzing turned into fuel. Every attack, every shadow cast on me only strengthened my determination not to let manipulation prevail over justice. In one of those moments when exhaustion was lurking, I received a new contact, another voice in the shadows. This time it was someone who introduced himself as a former judicial system official, a man who had resigned, tired of corruption but who still had a deep sensitivity to the weight of truth. His message was simple but powerful. He had crucial information about how the manipulation of the case had been planned and orchestrated from the beginning, with dates, meetings, and methods. Details that confirmed the connections between the names I had already found, but also added the human dimension of betrayal. In short, he offered me the pieces to assemble a clearer map of the network, only if I was willing to listen without prejudice or fear. I accepted cautiously. I knew it was not just another decision. It was opening a door that could reveal not only institutional corruption, but also names and faces who were pillars of the community, considered untouchable by many. But I could no longer turn back. The pursuit of justice does not feed on omissions or half-truths. In that conversation, with a trembling but firm voice, he also spoke to me about the system's vulnerability to the collusion of certain power groups and how he had decided to leave before becoming complicit. That confession lacked grandiose dramatism, but its authenticity deeply impacted me. It was a reminder that corruption doesn't always appear with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides behind prolonged silence and complicit indifference. From there, the pulse quickened in intensity. I began receiving alerts about unusual movements around the courthouse, anonymous calls with distorted voices, and sometimes emails ending with letters signed with false names but clear messages: back off, let it go, or face consequences. It was not just a warning, it was an open challenge. The windows of my office once again became a concern. I discovered traces of attempts to install illegal listening devices, which made me realize that everything I had managed to expose was much more dangerous to others than to myself. It was a chilling moment to recognize that my life had changed, that I was no longer just judging cases, but had become a key piece in a battle that transcends any courtroom. Yet, curiously, it was in that whirlwind that I found unexpected refuge in my routine. Conversations with loyal colleagues took on a new tone, trust was reinforced, and strategies were designed to face those pressures collectively. We were not a huge force, but we were determined and coherent, willing to uphold the truth above any position or personal gain. In those spontaneous talks and discreet meetings, I understood that authentic justice arises not only from written law, but from persistence and solidarity in adversity. That certainty kept me standing when uncertainty threatened to consume everything. I also began secretly writing notes to myself, intimate reflections where I poured out doubts, fears, and also strengths. It was a healthy exercise in self-knowledge that allowed me to discern what was real and what was a product of accumulated stress. I understood that the burden of representing justice could not be the responsibility of one person alone, that seeking the truth is a lonely path, but one that endures when we are willing to share responsibility and risk. In those moments of introspection, I found the strength to continue without succumbing to despair. The days stretched on with a strange mix of tense calm and bursts of action. I confirmed that those involved in the corruption network reacted with calculated moves to divert attention to other cases or fabricate parallel scandals that distracted public opinion. It was a chess game where every move was carefully planned to wear me down and delegitimize the evidence. But with firm responses and security measures, I was able to maintain the case's guiding thread, protecting the evidence and ensuring it was presented to the appropriate authorities for future appeals and reviews. It was a delicate balance between moving forward and not rushing. In the midst of this emotional and judicial roller coaster, an unexpected new twist emerged. During a meeting with one of the investigative journalists I was cooperating with, it was discovered that someone within our team had leaked information to certain interested parties to undermine the investigation from within. The shock was immense, like a dagger plunged into the chest. However, this internal betrayal served for my team to understand the need for greater rigor in information control, and we strengthened surveillance without creating an atmosphere of distrust that might fracture the alliance we had built. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. Justice requires that too, constant learning and adjustments in the face of adversity. Little by little, the clandestine support network solidified. Those people acting in the shadows began to publicly show signs of backing, with indirect testimonies and complaints that expanded the criticism toward a system fractured at its foundations. The social reaction, although partial, began to pressure those in power, generating some openness in the judicial process and the possibility that the system would review what had happened under a more rigorous and less politicized light. I felt that, finally, the seemingly insignificant drop of water had begun to form a river that could erode the hardest stones. Despite everything, I knew the path was far from fully traveled. The story, mine and that of this case, continued to be written with pages full of uncertainty and challenges. But I saw in the faces of those who supported me and in the conviction I never lost, a spark worth more than any verdict, the hope that, even amid darkness, persistent pursuit transforms realities. Thus, I decided, during that night that kept returning to my mind, that I would never again allow silence to be complicit. Because, in the end, beyond fear, justice is the bravest act we can uphold, and although the path is uncertain, it is the only road that truly makes us free. What came next was a meticulous process of unraveling networks woven with threads of silence and fear, where every new piece of information opened doors previously locked with invisible keys. The struggle was not only in the courts or official corridors, but on a less tangible terrain, where the truth faced the power that tries to shape it to its convenience. There were moments when it seemed that everything was falling apart, when manipulated reports appeared in the press, when people I had trusted began to distance themselves, pressured by forces hidden from the light, and when the walls of my office seemed to shrink under the sensation of a growing threat that went beyond the professional and touched the personal. Fatigue became a constant companion, heavy and silent, but also a reminder of the importance of what was at stake. I knew that giving up was never an option, even though exhaustion tried to convince me otherwise, because behind every file, every recorded conversation, there were lives that depended not only on a fair verdict, but on that imperfect system showing the ability to correct itself. It was a responsibility that transcended my individual role, a kind of call that insisted on not being ignored, even though the texture of that call was full of uncertainty and fear. Intense vigilance had to be maintained. I couldn't afford a single lapse. Discretion was the word guiding all my movements, and I learned to interpret silence as another form of communication, to decipher what was said between the lines, to read what was not written in the official documents. The circle of trust narrowed, and with it the fragility of alliances built amid the storm became evident. The double edge of loyalty became a constant. At times, those presenting themselves as allies showed doubts, and it was necessary to gauge every gesture carefully to avoid confusing help with threat. Amid all this complexity, an unexpected turn shook the foundations of the investigation. An unforeseen source, someone who until then had remained in the shadows, dared to appear with evidence that not only corroborated what was already suspected, but added a new element to the broth of suspicion. A network of international influence that seemed to be moving pieces with a greater reach than anticipated. This was not just a local case, nor simply internal corruption. It was a tangle reaching organizations and figures with power beyond the court where I signed verdicts. That revelation changed the perspective and for a moment made me question the magnitude of my commitment and the consequences I was willing to face. Aware that we were facing an enemy with resources capable of neutralizing any advance, we had to rethink strategies. Collaboration with investigative journalists took a priority role, and together we designed tactics to protect the identities of sources and bring the truth to light without risking the integrity of those involved. It was a work of patience, of weaving and holding threads with the precision of a craftsman, knowing that a single mistake could mean the failure of everything built. In those weeks, I learned more than ever the value of strategic silence, the importance of choosing when and how to act to maximize impact and reduce vulnerability. My close circle became a refuge and a space to recharge strength. There, in those intimate conversations, where voices lowered and tones became conspiratorial, I found a shield in shared humanity and an unexpected source of hope. We were not just a group of officials and allies. We were a force that felt the weight of responsibility on its shoulders, and that weight united and strengthened us. Understanding that this fight was not mine alone, that it was a battle to be carried out as a community, lifted me in moments when loneliness seemed to swallow all the air around me. That solidarity was undoubtedly the invisible support that allowed the process to continue when everything seemed ready to collapse. But the pressure did not lessen. On the contrary, it intensified through more subtle means. Discrediting campaigns arose that undermined not only my name, but also those who dared to support the cause. Power uses fear and manipulation with brutal effectiveness, and I had to learn to navigate that turbulent sea with my gaze fixed on the horizon, not allowing the waves to throw me off course. I felt the wear, the corrosion caused by being the constant target of direct and indirect attacks, but also the inevitability of moving forward, because retreating would mean leaving space for injustice to become eternal. At one particular moment, the pressure escalated to levels I had never imagined. It was one night when, already in my office, I found clear signs that someone had entered without permission, not to steal documents, but to install devices that monitored my movements and conversations. The idea of being observed so invasively paralyzed me for a few seconds. A mix of anger and vulnerability took hold of me, but only then did I understand the true dimension of the danger. It was not just a professional issue, it was a personal siege, an attempt to silence me not with a court order, but with blatant intimidation. That night, more than ever, I knew I was playing a game where every step had to be measured precisely, and that any mistake could have irreversible consequences. However, despite the fear, that episode reaffirmed that the path I had chosen was right. Under no circumstances could I allow silence or fear to win the battle. Justice, with all its imperfections, was a beacon that had to remain lit even in the darkest storms. The fragility of the situation, far from paralyzing me, pushed me to strengthen my alliances, to seek new allies, and to devise stronger strategies to protect not only the case, but everything that case represented. Public trust in the possibility of an honest system. Amid this whirlwind, an unexpected gesture emerged that marked a turning point. A group of organized citizens began to publicly demonstrate, not only in defense of the case, but supporting the idea of transparent and courageous justice. They were anonymous people, with no apparent ties to the judicial system, who somehow grasped the importance of this struggle transcending the courts and becoming a collective act. Their voices, initially timid, grew stronger until they became a chorus that could not be ignored and, although not resolving the situation immediately, added pressure and made the conflict visible as an unavoidable matter of public interest. The citizen support also triggered reactions within the system that seemed to herald changes, timid but significant. Some institutions began opening parallel investigations, new testimonies emerged from unexpected places, and the machinery that had previously tried to quietly crush the case began to show cracks. Seeing how truth, fueled by that constancy and collective strength, found paths where it seemed impossible to advance was one of the most rewarding and emotional moments of this entire experience. Understanding that I was not alone in this fight, nor was hopelessness invincible, reaffirmed my belief that the search is worth sustaining, even when the future seems too uncertain. At the same time, I learned that every process of change brings wounds. There were relationships that could not be maintained, friendships that suffered, and personal spaces marked by constant pressure. The balance between duty and life itself wavered every day, and many times I asked myself what would remain of me when all this ended. But these questions momentarily dissipated with every advance, with every new piece of data confirming that not all was lost, and that my efforts, fragile and human as they were part of a greater process, of a story that needed telling and had the power to transform what seemed unbreakable. Sleepless nights continued, not only due to the workload and tension, but because in those silent moments my mind ran over every detail, every testimony, trying to connect points, understand hidden motivations, and anticipate moves. It was a vigil in many senses, the need not to close my eyes precisely to prevent the darkness from hiding what needed to come to light. That feeling became almost a personal trademark, a symbol of resistance and constant alertness that colored my life with an intensity incomprehensible to those who did not live in that same context. But it was also a painful and powerful reminder of why I decided to dedicate my life to justice in the first place. Gradually, the investigation began to have visible effects in the judicial community and society at large. Some formerly respected faces now showed signs of uncertainty and nervousness. Speeches that once seemed impenetrable began to fragment in the face of accumulated evidence. The verdict I signed that time, which left me with that lingering doubt, became a starting point for questioning norms and practices that had until then been accepted without challenge. However, I knew this was only a first step, and behind that apparent calm could hide the efforts of forces determined to preserve the status quo at all costs. The weight of this entire whirlwind led me to deeply reflect on the role of the judge and justice itself. I saw firsthand that the verdict was not the end of responsibility, but perhaps only the beginning of a far more intense and complex battle. I learned that true justice is not an isolated act, but a constantly moving process that challenges, confronts hidden powers, and requires not only knowledge of the law but courage, patience, and a firm will to uphold the truth even when all factors invite surrender. The night I didn't close my eyes, the one in which fear, uncertainty, and hope mixed in a whirlwind of emotions, remains etched in my memory as a lesson of resistance and commitment. It was a reminder that justice, beyond statutes and procedures, is a condition of the soul that demands integrity even in the most adverse circumstances. And although the path remains uncertain and hostile, I know that every action, every word, and every decision taken with honor has the power to open windows where before there were only walls. This is how I continue my work, not with absolute certainty of victory, but with the conviction that relentless pursuit, shared courage, and refusal to let silence be complicit are ultimately the pillars that uphold hope. Because justice, in its most authentic form, is the constant struggle to balance forces, to give voice to those who have been silenced, and to remind that, though darkness may seem to dominate, there is always space for the light born from those who dare to look straight into the abyss and not look away. When I thought the worst was over, reality revealed an even darker and more complex face. An unexpected twist, almost like a whisper slipping through the darkness, uncovered that the web of corruption and manipulation extended beyond what anyone had imagined. It was no longer just a fight against local interests or known corrupt actors. Links appeared with figures whose power and reach surpassed territories and borders, as if we were facing a many-headed monster that, when you cut off one head, others emerged with greater ferocity. That revelation not only increased the pressure, but also tightened even more the rope of uncertainty in which my commitment was swinging. There were days when the feeling of being trapped in a relentless tangle became unbearable. I felt that every move was watched, that even the air seemed heavy, filled with invisible gazes. But instead of sinking me, it became an alarm call that forced me to grow, to find within myself the courage and resilience I thought were spent. I learned to move cautiously, yes, but also with determination, to weave alliances carefully and patiently, to value silence not as a loss, but as a strategy of power. Every word I said and every gesture I made was measured with surgical precision, aware that any mistake could cost more than simple professional consequences. Living with that level of tension is something that, honestly, no one should have to endure. It is an invisible burden, almost a phantom weight that erodes strength from within. But it also teaches something fundamental, that justice, true justice, is something sustained not only by the letter of the law but by those willing to risk everything to defend it. It is in those moments, when I doubted myself and the path, when I received discreet messages, minimal gestures of support, or secret testimonies, that I was reminded I was not alone. That this entire fight was also others, that there was a silent but firm people behind, waiting for someone daring to raise their voice. At one of the most critical moments, when the threat no longer came only in words or looks, but in concrete actions, I decided to step forward and change everything. I couldn't keep playing defense. I needed to take the initiative to protect not only my integrity, but that of those working with me and the integrity of the system I was trying to save. So, in a risky decision, I made public certain fragments of the investigation, controlled details, but enough to ignite a flame no one could extinguish with manipulation or fear. It was a brave act, yes, but also desperate, a scream amid the storm to attract attention and demand that the truth finally have a place in the public debate. That revelation triggered a chain reaction I hadn't expected. Public opinion mobilized, pressure on institutions became unbearable, and some of those I believed immovable began to stagger. It was, however, a bittersweet victory. Because it wasn't just the enemy that came to light, cracks also appeared within my own circle, doubts from those who saw their safety or careers at risk by being close to such an explosive cause. Reality then showed me that the fight for justice has no absolute heroes or clear villains, but complex people with fears and contradictions, navigating slippery ground between loyalty and survival. With each advance, with every new piece of evidence unveiled, the chessboard grew more complex. New factions emerged, unexpected alliances, and betrayals that burned like cold fire. Attempts to discredit my work intensified, and I had to face defamation campaigns designed to erode not only my image, but the public's trust in the process itself. The pressure reached a point where health became a real concern, and in the long, lonely nights, while trying to catch my breath, I wondered what would be left of Latasha Coleman when all this ended. That woman who swore to protect the law and the truth, how would she survive this battle without losing herself in the fight? But just when fatigue threatened to overcome me, something almost miraculous happened. Society's solidarity crystallized into an unstoppable force. It wasn't just the voices of a few willing to speak out. It was a genuine movement demanding justice, transparency, and real change. reaching from the streets to the most remote institutions. Seeing those anonymous citizens protesting fearlessly, supporting the cause with a determination rivaling my own, filled me with renewed hope. I realized then that this fight, though very personal, did not belong to me alone but was part of a larger social process, an awakening that could not be stopped by the shadows of power. Thus, amid the chaos, I began to see signs of transformation. The system, slow and rigid, started to show hints of change, even if only on the surface. Parallel new investigations began, some involved parties started to give surprising statements, and the networks of impunity began to unravel, though with evident pain and resistance. Every step we took was a small triumph against the darkness that seemed to want to swallow us all. And although it was a fragile victory, born from tension and constant risk, it had an invaluable worth. The hope that justice could be more than an ideal, that it could be a reality with will and persistence. However, no one said this path was easy or free from losses. The pressure, constant surveillance, the need for discretion, and the emotional burden strained personal relationships, wore down friendships, and made private life more guarded than ever. That cost accompanied me like an relentless shadow, reminding me that fighting the system was not only a professional strain, but a test of human and moral endurance. And although at times loneliness and doubt seemed to gain ground, every advance and every show of support gave me back a bit of the vital energy I needed to keep going. Looking back to that night when I didn't close my eyes, I now see that it was not simply a vigil marked by fear or uncertainty. It was a silent promise, an act of inner resistance that sustained me going forward. I understood that true judicial commitment is not measured by signed sentences, but by the courage to face the unknown, by the ability to uphold the truth even when darkness burns, and by the conviction that justice, that tireless and sometimes painful pursuit, is what keeps human hope alive. That night, which seemed eternal, was, in reality, the starting point to keep fighting, to not let silence have the last word. I now know this story does not end here, far from it. Although the paths are still filled with shadows, the light ignited by the decision to look into the abyss without turning away is the same that can illuminate the change we so desperately need. And as long as that light remains alive in those willing not to yield, justice will be more than a word. It will be an act, a challenge, a permanent promise that what is right can prevail, not because it is easy, but because there are those willing to hold it up, night after night, without closing their eyes.